Hey everyone, Professor Lamar here, and welcome to video 2 in Chapter 7. For this video, what we're going to talk about is, we're just going to jump right back into what we were last talking about with Chapter 7, and we're going to now talk about, oh, there we go. Okay, so if that kind of messed up a little bit, sorry. But what we're going to do is, in this video, is talk about the types of ways that participants can respond on survey questions. So first, question responses can either be open-ended responses or close-ended responses. Let's talk about close-ended first and the advantages that come with this. Close-ended responses are very, very common on surveys, and often the reason why is because they tend to be easier to analyze statistically. With a close-ended response, participants can choose from a certain number of response alternatives or response options. And there's only so many options that participants can select from. Think about your standard multiple choice question. It tends to have 4 options. You could select options A, B, C, or D. Sometimes there's a 5th option there if there's an E. But if you're answering a multiple choice question on a test, you have to choose one of those options. There's no other thing to do. And that's exactly what a closed-ended question does. It gives participants a limited number of response alternatives or response options, and they have to choose one of those. Now, I want you to look at this question here. This is an example of a close-ended question. What is the most important thing someone should learn before moving away from home? Is it A, cooking food, B, doing laundry, C, time management, or D, financial competency? Now, if we were in class, I'd ask you to raise your hands and actually vote, and we would be able to see what the most important thing we think someone should learn before they move away from home. Now, I can't assess how we're feeling as a class virtually through an asynchronous format, at least. But generally, when I've taught this in the past, most people tend to think that option D, financial competency, is the most important thing that someone should learn before they move away from home. Now, this is an example of a close-ended question, though, because people had to choose either A, B, C, or D. You couldn't just think of something on your own, right? You couldn't answer this question however you saw fit. You had to choose one of these options. So while financial competency might be a really important skill someone should learn, it might not be the first thing that everyone thought of when they first saw this question stem. One of the limitations with close-ended responses or close-ended questions is that participants can only choose from the options that are given, and those options might not always reflect the full range of responses participants would otherwise give. It essentially limits our participants and makes them choose between whatever we think is most important and whatever we include as these options here. And so that can be a little bit tricky for researchers and for participants when it comes to getting really rigorous, solid data. But with that in mind, having a close-ended response question is a really nice way to get data that's easily interpretable and analyzable through statistics. When we know, for instance, how many people select D relative to A, B, and C, we can easily report those percentages and things like that. And so close-ended responses are very easy to analyze statistically, which is a real advantage there overall. But let's talk about open-ended responses. With an open-ended response, participants are free to answer however they like. So we could even take the exact same question. What is the most important thing someone should learn before moving away from home? And we could just leave participants free to answer however they want. Now, this is really cool because we're likely to get more diversity in our responses than we were with the close-ended options. Participants could still answer financial competency if that's what they think of, but they could also answer a variety of other things, like literally anything. And there are some pros and cons that come with that. With open-ended questions, we are more likely to get a true understanding of how participants really feel because they can answer literally in any way possible. There is an infinite range of responses that could happen here, which is kind of good and bad. Now, if participants can answer any way they want, while we're likely to capture exactly how they feel and have a little bit more like of that richness and depth of data, it's also much harder to analyze that data. Participants will likely word things in their own words. And so we have to decide how to categorize participant responses, how to group things together, what to keep separate. For instance, someone can mention financial competency. Someone else might say financial skills. Someone else might say money management. Do we put those all together and call it the same thing? Or do you think those things should be separated? That's up to the researcher. And the researcher has to go through a lot more work to analyze open-ended questions. So open-ended questions, the advantage is that participants can answer any way they like, and therefore we get a true, solid understanding of how participants feel. But the disadvantage is it's harder to analyze that data. Close-ended responses, again, are much easier to analyze statistically, but we limit participants and how they can respond. Now, close-ended questions tend to be very common. So let's talk about some of the common types of close-ended responses that we can give our participants. I want you to think about what you would do in your research projects too. It's likely that as you have some questions, these questions might be close-ended questions, at least in some cases. And I want you to think about what types of question formats will work best for your variables. The first thing I want you to think about are the number of options or response alternatives that you give participants. You don't want to overwhelm your participants by giving them so many different options to choose from. Like, for instance, if you asked your participants to rate the extent to which they agree or disagree with a variety of statements, but you gave them a 20-point scale of agreement, it's going to be hard for them to look at each of those 20 points, like very, very super strongly disagree to very, very strongly disagree to very much disagree and so on. Like each and every point along the way, if there's 20 points there, that's going to overwhelm your participants. It's going to be too much. Alternatively, when working with a scaled response that could have multiple options, we probably also don't want to only include just a couple of those options for our participants. Like, if we're asking a scaled question, that could theoretically have maybe 5 different points to the scale, like strongly disagree, disagree, neutral, agree, strongly agree. We probably don't want to just limit our participants to 2 options there, agree or disagree. That kind of is harder than to, well, it's not harder, but if we limit the options that participants can give, we can kind of limit how they think about those questions, which in some cases could be problematic. Now, ultimately though, with all of these things, there's no clear right or wrong for every group, every survey, every question, or every construct. Research methods is a science of it depends. And so everything is contextually based. And that means that sometimes you might have a question where you only give participants 2 options to choose from. That doesn't mean it's bad. It does mean, though, that you should think about what works best for you and what works best for your survey. All right, now let's talk about these types of scales we can give participants. We often ask participants to answer questions with a rating scale that asks participants to provide judgments of how much they feel or think about something. A common scale is called a graphic rating scale, but we also have other things like semantic differential scales, nonverbal scales, commonly used for children, and Likert scales. Quick side note, I think Likert is technically pronounced Likert, not liquor like the caption said, but again, I think Likert, L-I-K-E-R-T, is pronounced Likert, but I say Likert, I hear Likert most of the time. I'm going to continue saying that for this, though again, it seems like Google Captions are having a challenging time understanding Likert. Okay, oh, I got it, good, okay. So now let's do an example of each of these. A graphic rating scale provides participants with a line that is 100 millimeters long. It's a continuous line, like you see right here, and it's anchored with descriptions on either end. Now, participants should look at this line and then mark any point along the line that represents how they feel. So if we look at this question here, how much did you enjoy the last season of The Good Place? one end of the scale says loved it, the other end of the scale says did not love it. And then participants could mark anywhere along that scale to represent how they feel. One of the cool things about a graphic rating scale is that participants can literally mark anywhere along here, which means that we can capture finite differences between participants. But one of the disadvantages here is that it's a little bit challenging to compare responses overall, because there's no clear marker between one point and the next across participants. Again, though, graphic rating scales always have this continuous line. It always has to be 100 millimeters, and it's anchored with descriptions on either end. This is similar but distinctly different from a semantic differential scale. In a semantic differential scale, participants are asked to rate something across a variety of dimensions, and you can see that there's dashed lines here between descriptors. So instead of having a continuous line, we now have different markers that participants can select from. And so they have to mark one of these things here. They can't just choose any point along those lines. The key thing about a semantic differential, though, is that the anchors on either end of that scale must be polar opposite adjectives. Again, these anchors here must be polar opposite adjectives. Look at this question, for instance. How would you describe Kmart, Walmart, and Target on the following scale? Clean, what's the opposite of clean? Dirty. Bright, what's the opposite of bright? Dark. Low quality, opposite is high quality, and then so on. This is a semantic differential because there's polar opposite adjectives anchoring both sides of the scale. Again, the other key difference between semantic differentials and graphic rating scales is that the semantic differential has a broken up or dash line, and participants have to choose one marker on that dash line to record how they feel. Now, let's talk about nonverbal scales. Nonverbal scales have no words on them. They often ask participants to point to an image to indicate how they're feeling. And so they tend to be very commonly used with children, particularly children who go to a doctor's office with some sort of injury. The doctor can ask the child how much pain are they in? And then the child can point to a certain face that represents the pain that they're feeling. Now, the great thing about nonverbal scales is that they work really well with any person or a community of people who might have a challenging time expressing themselves with words. This can be a really useful way to still get a feel for how these people are feeling or what they're going through, which is great. However, nonverbal scales are also inherently subjective, and arguably survey research tends to be a bit subjective because people are just evaluating themselves. But nonverbal scales in particular can be a little bit subjective because with something like this, when asking how much pain someone's in, or in other words, how hard was your homework last night, if you're looking at this picture, someone could report a value of 6 for the amount of pain that they're in, and someone else could theoretically feel the same amount of pain, but think that it's, a value of a 4. Basically, this could lead to subjective interpretation, and that's not necessarily a terrible thing. Because again, these scales can be really good for working with people who cannot express themselves with words. Now, finally, let's talk about those Likert scales. Likert scales are always asking questions about agreement. Again, Likert scales always ask about agreement. That means that any question that you have seen or any question that you create that asks participants to agree, or disagree, or strongly disagree, those are Likert scales. That's it. So now in this video, we talked about the different ways participants can respond. To kind of wrap up, we have close-ended and open-ended responses, and we talked about the different rating scales that are very commonly used for close-ended questions. In the next video, we'll talk about how we can format the survey in a professional way, and this will help us complete half of Lab 13. So without any further ado, I'll see you all then.